Aye. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaisnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Visakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhaevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvisesa Sunyavari Vastyachare Jatarine Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So, yeah. We're here at chapter 17, the second half of chapter 17 on the Bowery. And if anyone wants to kick it off, please. Mahamantra Prabhu. Yeah.
Okay. So they are talking on the battlefield, and Arjuna says, I will not fight. I will not fight with my relatives and brothers for the sake of achieving some kingdom. No, no. Now, to the ordinary man, it appears that Arjuna is a very nice man, non-violent. He has given up everything for the sake of his relatives. Oh, what a nice man he is. This is the ordinary calculation. But what does Krishna say? He says, you are damned fool number one. Now just see, the things which are estimated in the public eye as very nice, very good, that is here condemned by God. So you have to see whether the Supreme Consciousness is pleased with their actions. And Arjuna's action was not approved by Lord Krishna. It was for his own whim, sense gratification, that at first he would not fight, but in the end, for Krishna's satisfaction, he did fight, and that is our perfection, when we act for the satisfaction of the Supreme Consciousness. At this point, some in the audience are filled with reservations. They are all opposed to the role of the United States in Vietnam, and this idea is very difficult for them. Like Arjuna, they want peace, so why is a Swami sanctioning war? He explains, yes, Arjuna's idea not to fight is good, but then Krishna, the Supreme Consciousness, instructs him to fight anyway. Therefore, Arjuna's fighting is above mundane ethics. It is absolute. If we follow Arjuna, give up good and bad, and act for Krishna, not for our sense gratification, then that is perfect, because Krishna is the Supreme Consciousness. To some in the audience, although his answer seemed philosophically sound, it's not quite what they wanted to hear. Yeah, I'm going to move me window a little bit. It's okay, thanks. So still, they want to know his political views. Does he support America's involvement in Vietnam? Is he anti-war? But Prabhupada is neither hawk nor dove. He has no political motive behind his example of Krishna and Arjuna. His theme is simple and pure. Beyond the good and the bad is the absolute, and to act in accord with the absolute is also beyond good and bad. But what about Vietnam? Does Krishna say to fight there? No, Swamiji answers. The Vietnam War is different from the Kurukshetra War. In the Battle of Kurukshetra, Krishna was personally present, asking Arjuna to fight. Vietnam is different. But his audience adds yet another objection. If he is not addressing the Vietnamese war, then why not? After all, this is 1966. If he isn't talking about the war, then what is his relevancy? The Swami replies that his message is actually the most urgent and relevant. The Vietnamese war was an inevitable karmic reaction. It was one symptom, not the whole problem. And only this philosophy, surrender to the Supreme Consciousness, addresses the real problem. But for many, the reference to fighting is so emotionally charged that they can't go beyond the immediate politics of Vietnam to Prabhupada's real message of surrender to the Supreme Consciousness. They respect the Swami. They realize he's referring to a deeper philosophy. Yet the story of Arjuna and the war makes things difficult. The Swami nonetheless continues to refer to Arjuna's fighting as the classic example of Bhagavad Gita's basic teaching. It's not the basic teaching his audience is having difficulty with. It's the example. Prabhupada has deliberately handed his audience a volatile analogy. He hasn't come to join their peace movement, and he doesn't accept their short-sighted concept of peace. He confronts them. It is better to fight in Krishna consciousness than to live in a so-called peace devoid of God realization. Yes, the example is hard for them to accept. It makes them think. And if they do accept, then they might come near to understanding the absolute. It is very difficult dovetailing our consciousness with the Supreme Consciousness. Not at all. Not at all. No sane man will say, oh, it is not possible. He isn't suggesting that to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness, they will have to go fight in Vietnam or perform some other horrible act on behalf of God. He knows that spiritual life will have to be more attractive than material life, or his audience will never take to it. He wants to bring the theme of dovetailing with the Supreme Consciousness down to something practical, something all attractive and beautiful, something anyone could do and would want to do. He wants to encourage them by saying that they can do their own thing, but for Krishna. Arjuna, after all, was a lifetime warrior. Krishna didn't ask him to give up his work, but to do it for the Supreme. So Prabhupada is asking the same of his audience. And they can begin with something as simple as offering their food to God. Because everyone has to eat, so God wants to eat something. Why don't you first offer your food to God? Then you eat. But you may say, but if God takes it away, then how shall I eat? No, God will not take it. Daily, after preparing our foodstuffs, we are offering to Krishna. There is a witness. Mr. David has seen, Prabhupada. God eats, but his spiritual eating is such that even after he is eating, the whole thing is still there. So we shall not suffer a pinch if we dovetail our desires with the Supreme Lord. We simply have to learn the art, how to dovetail. Nothing has to be changed. The fighting man did not change into an artist or a musician. If you are a fighting man, you remain a fighting man. If you are a musician, you remain a musician. If you are a medical man, you remain a medical man. Whatever you are, you remain, but dovetail it. If by my eating the Lord is satisfied, then that is my perfection. If by my fighting the Lord is satisfied, then that is my perfection. So in every sphere of life, we have to know whether the Lord is satisfied. That technique we have to learn. Then it is as easy as anything. We have to stop creating our own plans and thoughts and take the perfect plans from the Supreme Lord and execute them. That will become the perfection of our life. I'll let someone else take over.
Okay, mantra. Hello.
Yeah, please, Prabhu. We'd love to hear you read.
And Lord Chaitanya has made acting, is the volume okay? And Lord Chaitanya has made acting on the platform of consciousness very easy. Just as there are some note makers of school books, easy study. So Lord Chaitanya has recommended that you be engaged in whatever occupation, but just hear about Krishna. Continue to hear the Bhagavad Gita and chant Hare Krishna. It is for this that we are trying to organize this institution. So you have come, and whatever work you do, it doesn't matter. Everything will be adjusted by and by, as our mind becomes clear simply by hearing. If you continue this process, chanting the Krishna name, you will practically see how much your heart is becoming clear and how much you are making progress towards spiritual realization, the real identity of pure consciousness. Prabhupada is speaking on behalf of the Supreme Consciousness, and he offers his day-to-day activities as an example of dovetailing with the Supreme. I am here always working at something, reading or writing, 24 hours. Simply when I feel hungry, I take some food. And simply when I feel sleepy, I go to bed. Otherwise, I don't feel fatigued. You can ask Mr. David whether I am not doing this. Of course, the Swami's daily routine doesn't require certification from David Allen, and any of his regular visitors can see that he is transcendental. His personal life is a perfect example of dovetailing with the Supreme Consciousness. Prabhupada has always kept himself dovetailed with the Supreme. He had been perfectly dovetailed in Vrindavan also, and had no personal need or motive to come to America and live on the Bowery. It was for others' sake that he came to the Bowery. And it is for others' benefit that he is speaking tonight. His spiritual master and Lord Krishna wanted the conditioned souls to come out of their illusion before it is too late. Speaking vigorously, even until he becomes physically exhausted, sometimes shouting, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing, he gives his audience as much as he feels they can take. As the emissary of Krishna and the disciplic succession, he can boldly shout that everyone should dovetail with the Supreme. He can speak as strongly as he likes for as long as they're willing to listen. He is a sadhu. The Sanskrit word means saint and one who cuts. And he repeats the same message that for thousands of years sadhus of the original Vedic culture have spoken. He is reviving the eternal spirit of the Vedic wisdom to cut the knots of ignorance and illusion. So everything is illusion from the beginning of our birth. And that illusion is so strong that it is very difficult to get out of. The whole thing is illusion. Birth is illusion. The body is illusion. The body relationship and the country are illusion. The father is illusion. The mother is illusion. The wife is illusion. The children are illusion. Everything is illusion. And we are contacting that illusion thinking that we are very learned, advanced. We are imagining so many things. But as soon as death comes, the actual fact that then we forget everything. We forget our country. We forget our relatives. We forget our wife, children, father, mother. Everything is gone. Mike Grant, I went up to him afterward. I had the same feeling I'd had on other occasions when I'd been here to hear famous people in concerts. I was always interested in going by after concerts to see musicians and singers, just to meet them and see what they were like. I had a similar feeling after Swamiji spoke. So I went up and started talking, but the experience was different from the others in that he wasn't in a hurry. He could talk to me, whereas others, all you could do was get in a few words. They were always more interested in something else. But he was a person who was actually showing some interest in me as a person. And I was so overwhelmed that I ran out of things to say very quickly. I was surprised. Our meeting broke off on the basis of my not having anything further to say. It was just the opposite of so many other experiences where some performer would be hurrying off to do something else. This time, I was the one who couldn't continue. Someone else?
Prabhupada liked to take walks. From his doorstep at 94 Bowery, he would see directly across the street the Fulton Hotel, a 5-story flop house. Surrounding him were other lower Manhattan lodging houses whose tenants wandered the sidewalks from early morning till dark. An occasional flock of pigeons would stir and fly from one rooftop to the next or descend to the street. Traffic was heavy. The Bowery was part of a truck route to and from Brooklyn by way of the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges. The Bowery sloped gently downhill toward the north, and Prabhupada could see signboards, a few scraggly Manhattan trees, and the streetlights and traffic signals as far up as 4th Street. He could see Con Edison with its prominent clock tower, and if there were no clouds, the top of the Empire State Building on 34th Street. He would walk alone in the morning through the Bowery neighborhood. The month of May that year saw more frequent rains than was normal, and Prabhupada carried an umbrella. Sometimes he walked in the rain. He was not always alone. Sometimes he walked with one of his new friends and talked. Sometimes he shopped. Bitter melon, dal, hing, chickpea flour, and other specialty foods common in Indian vegetarian cuisine were available in Chinatown's nearby markets. On leaving the loft, he would walk south a few steps to the corner of the Bowery and Hester Street. Turning right on Hester, he would immediately be in Chinatown, where the shops, markets, and even the Manhattan Savings Bank were identified by signs lettered in Chinese. Sometimes he would walk 1 block further south to Canal Street with its Central Asian food market and many other street-side fruit and vegetable markets. In the early morning, the sidewalks were almost deserted, but as the shops began to open for business, the streets became crowded with local workers, shopkeepers, tourists, and aimless derelicts. The winding side streets of Chinatown were lined with hundreds of small stores, and parked cars lined both sides of the street. His walks on Hester would sometimes take him into Little Italy, which overlaps Chinatown at Mulberry Street. In this neighborhood, places like Chinese pork products and the Mi Yung Mi supermarket stood alongside Umberto's Clam House and the Puglia restaurant, advertising cappuccino alla Puglia, coffee from Puglia. His walks west of Bowery into Chinatown and Little Italy were mainly for shopping, but he also noticed prospective sites for a temple. Chatham Tower on Chatham Square particularly drew his attention. Sometimes he would walk in the opposite direction as far as the East River and Brooklyn Bridge. But when a friend warned him that a sniper had been firing at strollers along the river, he stopped going there. Despite the bad neighborhood where Prabhupada lived and walked, he was rarely disturbed. Often he would find several Bowery bums asleep or unconscious at his door, and he would have to step over them. Sometimes a drunk, simply out of his inability to maneuver, would bump into him, or a derelict would mutter something unintelligible or laugh at him. The more sober ones would stand and gesture courteously, ushering the Swami into or out of his door at 94 Bowery. He would pass among them, acknowledging their good manners as they cleared his path. Certainly, few of the Bowery men and others who saw him on his walks knew much about the small, elderly Indian sadhu, dressed in saffron and carrying an umbrella and a brown grocery sack. Sometimes Prabhupada would meet one of his new friends on the street. Jan, Michael Grant's girlfriend, met him on several occasions as he was out walking. Jan. I would see him in the midst of this potpourri of people down there, walking down the street. He always had an umbrella, and he would always have such a serene look on his face. He would just be taking his afternoon jaunts, walking along, sometimes stepping over the drunks. And I would always get sort of nervous when I would meet him on the sidewalk. He would say, "Are you chanting?" And I would say, "Sometimes." And then he would say, "That's a good girl."
Sitting cross-legged, his back to the shelf with its assortment of potted plants, a white chador wrapped in wide, loose folds across his body, Prabhupada looked grave, almost sorrowful. The picture and an accompanying article appeared in a June issue of the Village Voice. The article read, "The meeting of the mystical West and practical East comes alive in the curious contrast between A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami and his American disciples. The Swami, a cultivated man of 70 with a distinguished education, is here for a year to preach his gospel of peace, goodwill, nearness to God, and more practically, to raise money for his American church. Like his teachings, the Swami is sensible and direct. His main teaching is that mankind may come closer to God by reciting his holy name. Despite the fact that the Swami came to America to seek out the root of godless materialism, a disease, he said, that has already enveloped India, he is a realistic man. If there is any place on earth with money to build a temple, it is here. The Swami wishes to found in America an international society for Krishna consciousness, which will be open for anyone, including women. The article had been written by Howard Smith. He had first heard of the Swami by a phone call from a contact who had told him of an interesting holy man from India living in a loft in the Bowery. Go there any time, Howard's contact had told him. He's always there. I think you will find it fascinating. I believe he's about to start a major religious movement. Howard Smith. So I went down there and went upstairs into this very funky artist's loft. There were carpets all over the place, old and worn out, and a lot of people sitting around in various kinds of hippie garb, plus what I think they must have thought was Indian garb. Most of them were sitting alone around the room, facing the wall like they had nothing to do with each other. They were sitting cross-legged, and each one seemed to be doing something different. Nobody paid any attention to me when I walked in. I saw shoes lined up and I thought, maybe I'm supposed to take off my shoes. But nobody said anything to me, so I walked around the edge of the carpet, looking for somebody to pay attention to me. I wondered what was going on, and I didn't want to interrupt anybody, because they all seemed deep in whatever kind of prayers they were doing. In the back of the loft, I noticed a little curtain, an Indian madras type of curtain, and so I decided I'd peer into that area. I looked in, and there was Swami Bhaktivedanta, sitting there cross-legged in saffron garments with the markings on his forehead and nose, and his hand in the bead bag. Even though he looked like the real thing, he seemed more approachable, and I said, hello, and he looked up. I said, Swami Bhaktivedanta? And he said, yes. I said, I am Howard Smith. I was expecting to sit down, so I said, excuse me, I have to take off my shoes. And he said, why do you want to take off your shoes? I said, I don't know, I saw all the shoes out there. And he said, I didn't ask you to take your shoes off. I said, what are all those people out there doing? And he said, I don't know, and they don't know what they're doing. I am trying to teach them, and they seem to be misunderstanding me. They are very confused people. Then we sat and talked, and I liked him a lot right away. I mean, I'd met a lot of other Swamis, and I didn't like them too much. I don't think it's fair to lump them all together and say those Swamis in India. But he was very, very basic, and that's what I seemed to like about him. He not only made me feel at ease, but he seemed very open and honest, like he asked my advice on things. He was very new in the country. I thought his ideas stood a good chance of taking hold because he seemed so practical. His head didn't seem to be in the clouds. He wasn't talking mysticism every third word. I guess that is where his soul was at, but that isn't where his normal conversational consciousness was at. Then he said several people had told him that the voice would be a very good place to be written up, and that basically it would reach the kind of people who already perhaps had a leaning or interest in what he was preaching. And I said that I thought he was correct. He asked me if I had read any books or knew anything about Indian culture, and I said no, I didn't really. We talked a little, and he explained to me that he had these books in English that he had already translated in India. He handed those to me and said, if you want more background, you can read these. It was obvious to me that I was not talking to some fellow who had just decided that he had seen God and was going to tell people about it. He seemed like an educated man, much more than myself actually, and I liked his humbleness. I just plain liked the guy. He explained everything I wanted to know, the significance of what he was wearing, the mark on his forehead, the bead bag, and I liked all his explanations. Everything was very practical. Then he talked about temples all over the world, and he said, well, we have got a long way to go, but I am very patient. Would somebody else like to read?
Prabhupada wrote that the voice article had referred to as his American church. There was life in his lectures and kirtans, and at least he was acquiring a small regular following. But from India, there was no hope. He had continued corresponding with Srimati Morarji, his godbrothers, and the Indian central government, but their replies had not been encouraging. In the faith that Padam Pat Singayana would agree to plans for a Krishna temple in Manhattan and finance its construction, Prabhupada had petitioned New Delhi to sanction the release of foreign exchange. He had written to the Reserve Bank of India, New Delhi, I want to establish this culture center. For this, I wish to get some exchange from India. I think there are good prospects all over the world for propagating the culture of how to love God in these days of forgetfulness. A month later, the Indian bank had advised him to submit his request through the Indian embassy in Washington to the finance minister of the Indian central government. Prabhupada had complied, and another month had passed and no word from the government. One of his godbrothers had written that Swamiji should come back to India and work personally to get the government sanction. But Prabhupada didn't want to leave America now. He wrote to Srimati Morarji, I'm trying to avoid the journey to India and again coming back, especially for the reason that I'm holding at the above address classes thrice a week and training some American youth in the matter of Sanskrit and devotional service to the Lord. Some of these are taking lessons very sincerely, and in the future they may be very good Vaishnavas according to the rigid standards. One day, a curious, unsolicited correspondent wrote to Prabhupada from India. His name was Mukti Brahmachari, introducing himself as a disciple of one of Prabhupada's godbrothers and reminding Prabhupada of their past slight acquaintance. Mukti wrote of his eagerness to join Prabhupada in America. Certainly, Prabhupada still had hopes for getting assistance from his godbrothers in India. This mission is not simply one man's work. Therefore, he invited Mukti to come to America and asked him to request his guru to cooperate by working personally to secure government sanction for the release of foreign exchange. Mukti wrote back, reaffirming his eagerness but expressing doubt that his spiritual master would give him permission. Mukti thought he should first come to the United States and then request his spiritual master's help. Prabhupada was annoyed and he sent an immediate reply. Is preaching in America my private business? Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted to construct some temples in foreign countries as preaching centers of the message of Rupa Goswami Raghunath. I am trying to do this in this part of the world. Money is ready and the opportunity is open. If by seeing finance minister this work can be facilitated, why should we wait? Because you cannot talk with your Guru Maharaj about cooperation because you're afraid your journey will be cancelled. Please do not think in that way. Take everything as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada's work and try to do the needful. Do not think for a moment that my interest is different from that of your Guru Maharaj. We are executing the will of Srila Prabhupada according to our own capacity. A combined effort would have been far better. Srila Rupa Goswami and Raghunath Das Goswami were two leading disciples of Lord Chaitanya in the 16th century. Mukti submitted the entire proposal before his spiritual master, who, as Mukti predicted, cancelled the trip. Although Mukti's guru was Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, he did not want to be involved, and he doubted that Prabhupada would actually get a donation from Padma Pat Singh Naya. And now Mukti Brahmachari also doubted, if your program is not bona fide, the approach to a big personality will be a ludicrous one, no doubt. On the same day that Prabhupada received the ludicrous letter, he also received the final blow of non-cooperation from the Indian government. Second Secretary Prakash Sang, and of the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. wrote, due to existing conditions of foreign exchange, stringency is not possible for the government of India to accede your request for release of foreign exchange. You may perhaps like to raise funds from residents in America. It was confirmed Prabhupada would have to work without outside help. He would continue alone in New York City. His last letter to Mukti Brahmachari revealed his deep faith and determination. So the controversy is now closed and there is no need of help from anyone else. We are not always successful in our attempts at preaching work, but such failures are certainly not ludicrous. In the absolute field, both success and failure are glorious. Even Lord Nityananda pretended to be a failure at converting Jagan Madai in the first attempt. Rather, he was personally injured in such attempt, but that was certainly not ludicrous. The whole thing was transcendental and it was glorious for all parties concerned.
If Krishna consciousness were ever to take hold in America, it would have to be without assistance from the Indian government or Indian finances. Not even a lone Indian brahmachari would join him. Krishna was revealing his plan to Prabhupada in a different way. With the Singhania sanction schemes finished and behind him, Prabhupada would turn all his energy towards the young men and women coming to him in his Bowery loft. He wrote to Srimati Maharaji, I am now trying to incorporate one cooperation of the local friends and admirers under the name International Society for Krishna Consciousness Incorporated. Of all his friends and admirers, Prabhupada gave his roommate, David Allen, the most personal attention and training. He felt he was giving David a special chance to become America's first genuine Vaishnava. Prabhupada would eventually return to India and he wanted to take David to Vrindavan. He would show him temple worship and train him for future preaching in the West. He had requested Srimati Maharaji to provide free passage for David as well as for himself. You'll be pleased to see this American boy. He is coming off a good family and is a sincere soul to this line of culture. There are others also in the class I am holding here, but I wish to take with me only one of them. I am very glad to say, Prabhupada said one evening in his lecture, that our Mr. David says, sometimes, Swamiji, I want to increase my spiritual life immediately. Prabhupada laughed as he imitated David's urgency. Take patience, I tell him. It will be done. Of course, when you have got such desire, God will help you. He is within you. He is simply trying to see how sincere you are. Then he will give you all opportunities to increase your spiritual life. At first, David and the Swami lived together peacefully in the large hall, the Swami working concentratedly on his side of the partition, David raging throughout the large open space. David, however, continued taking marijuana, LSD, and amphetamines, and Prabhupada had no choice but to tolerate it. Several times he told David that drugs and hallucinations would not help his spiritual life, but David would look distracted. He was becoming estranged from the Swami. But Prabhupada had a plan to use the loft as a temple, to transform it into New York's first temple of Radha Krishna, and he wanted David's cooperation. Although the neighborhood was one of the most miserable in the world, Prabhupada talked of bringing deities from Jaipur or Vrindavan and starting temple worship, even on the Bowery. He thought David might help. After all, they were roommates, so there could be no question of David's not cooperating, but he would have to give up his bad habits. Prabhupada was trying to help David, but David was too disturbed. He was headed for disaster, and so were Prabhupada's plans for the loft. Sometimes, even not under the influence of a drug, he would pace around the loft. Other times, he appeared to be deep in thought. One day, on a dose of LSD, he went completely crazy. As Carl Jurgens put it, he just flipped out, and the Swami had to deal with a crazy man. Things had been leading to this. He was a crazy kid who always took too much, but the real madness happened suddenly. Swamiji was working peacefully at his typewriter when David freaked out. David started moaning and pacing around the large open area of the loft. Then he began yelling, howling, and running all around. He went back to where the Swami was, and suddenly Prabhupada found himself face to face, not with David, nice David, who he was going to take to India to show the Brahmanas in Vrindavan, but a drugged, wild-eyed stranger, a madman. Prabhupada tried to speak to him, "What is the matter?" But David had nothing to say. There was no particular disagreement, just madness. Okay, would somebody else vote?
Hare Krishna. We can read a little bit and then pass it on again. Prabhupada moved quickly down the 4 flights of stairs. He had not stopped to gather up any of his belongings or even to decide where he would go or whether he would return. There had been no time to consider anything. He had taken quite a shock, and now he was leaving the arena of David's madness. The usual group of bums were sitting in the doorway, and with their customary flourish of courtesy, they allowed him to pass. They were used to the elderly swamis coming in and out, going shopping and returning, and they didn't bother him. But he was not going shopping today. Where was he going? He didn't know. He had come onto the street without knowing where he would go. He wasn't going back to the loft, that was for sure. But where could he go? The pigeons flew from roof to roof. Traffic rumbled by, and the ever-present bums loitered about, getting drunker on cheap, poisonous alcohol. Although Prabhupada's home had suddenly become an insane terror, the street at its door was also a hellish, dangerous place. He was shaken. He could call Dr. Mishra's and they might take him in. But that chapter of his life was over, and he had gone on to something better. He had his own classes, young people chanting and hearing. Was it all over now? After 9 months in America, he had finally gotten a good response to his preaching and kirtan. He couldn't just quit now. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, whom everyone knew and respected in Vrindavan as a distinguished scholar and devotee, who had an open invitation to see the Vice President of India and many other notables, now had to face starkly that he had not one friend of stature in the United States. Suddenly, he was as homeless as any derelict on the street. In fact, many of them, with their long-time births in flop houses, were more secure than he. They were ruined, but settled. The Bowery could be a chaotic hell if you weren't on a very purposeful errand, going directly to the store or back to your place. It was no place to stand wondering where will you live, or is there a friend you can turn to. He wasn't on his way to Chinatown to shop, nor was he taking a little stroll soon to return to the shelter of the loft. If he couldn't go to the loft, he had no place. How difficult it was becoming to preach in America amid these crazy people. He had written prophetically in his poem the day he arrived in Boston Harbor, "My dear Lord, I do not know why you have brought me here. Now you can do with me whatever you like. But I guess you have some business here. Otherwise, why would you bring me to this terrible place?" What about his scheduled classes? What about David? Should he go back and try and talk with the boy? This had been David's first fit of violence, but there had been other tense moments. David had a habit of leaving the soap on the floor of the shower stall, and Prabhupada had asked him not to because it was a hazard. But David wouldn't listen. Prabhupada had continued to remind him, and one day David had gotten angry and shouted at him. But there was no real enmity. Even today's incident had not been a matter of personal differences. The boy was a victim. Prabhupada walked quickly. He had free passage on the Scindia line. He could go home to Vrindavan. But his spiritual master had ordered him to come here. By the strong desire of Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he had written while crossing the Atlantic, the holy name of Lord Gauranga will be spread throughout all the countries of the Western world. Before nightfall, he would have to find some place to stay, a way to keep up the momentum of his preaching. This is what it meant to be working without government sponsorship, without the support of any religious organization, without a patron. It meant being vulnerable and insecure. Prabhupada faced the crisis as a test from Krishna. The instruction of Bhagavad Gita was to depend on Krishna for protection. In all activities, just depend upon me and work always under my protection. In such devotional service, be fully conscious of me. You will pass over all the obstacles of conditional life by my grace. He decided to phone Carl Jurgens and ask him to help. Hearing the Swami's voice on the phone, it was an emergency. Carl at once agreed that Prabhupada could move in with him and his wife, Eva. Their place was close by on Center Street, 5 blocks west of Bowery near Chinatown. Carl would be right over.
After Carl found Prabhupada, they went straight to Carl's place, an AIR loft, smaller than the one Prabhupada had been living in. It had a main living area, large and open, with areas for the kitchen and bedroom partitioned off. There were decorative indoor plants and a profusion of throw pillows placed all around. Carl's loft was much brighter than the dingy factory-like space in the loft on the Bowery. The floor was painted bright orange. Carl used to say it looked like the deck of a ship. The walls and ceiling were white, and light from 7 skylights filled the room. Carl and Eva settled the Swami in one corner. Prabhupada had left his belongings at David's loft and didn't want to go back, so Carl went over to pick up a few essential items. Prabhupada asked him to leave most of his things, including his books, suitcases, and reel-to-reel tape recorder where they were. Although by this time David had come down from the intense effects of the LSD, he remained crazy. When Carl arrived at the loft, the door was locked and David was inside, afraid to let anyone in, although finally he relented. He had shut and locked all the windows, making the loft oppressively hot and stuffy. Bill Epstein, who also came by that day, analysed David as having had a drug-induced nervous breakdown, a narcopsychosis. And although David was sorry he had exploded at the Swami, neither Bill nor Carl thought Prabhupada should live with David again. Apparently Prabhupada's chances of making the loft into a Radha Krishna temple were finished. Carl and Bill gathered up a few of the Swami's belongings, and David stayed behind in the loft. He wanted to be alone. Carl Jurgens knew Prabhupada's living habits and wanted to accommodate him with a suitable place to live and work. In a small alcove at one end of his loft, Carl had a small study, which he allocated for the Swami. Carl also set up a cushioned dais and arranged the living room around it so that guests could sit on the floor in a semicircle. Carl's wife, who didn't really like the idea of a Swami moving in, agreed to cover a few cushions with Indian Madras material for him anyway. Things went smoothly for a while. Prabhupada continued his morning and evening classes, and many of the Bowery hip crowd came by. 3 of his regular callers lived right in the same building, and a few others, including Carl's brother, were just around the block. Michael Grant, James Green, even David Allen came once. Don Nathanson, an artist. I was at Carl's loft, and the Swami comes strolling in one day, so I already knew he was on the scene from David's. Mostly musicians were coming. They were enjoying the private morning session with him. And that's really strange in itself, because these people were up almost all night, and he used to do it at 6 in the morning for 1 hour. He would lead them in chanting with his hand symbols. Dot, dot, da, dot, dot, da. It was strange because the crowd was heavy into drugs and they were well read, but for a short period they used to go every morning, 9 or 10 of them, and they felt very good about it. They felt very good that they did that in the morning. Carl felt that the creative group who came to see the Swami in his studio were all quick to enter into the mood of the kirtan, but they were using it in their own ways to supplement their own private visions and ecstasies. with no real intention of adopting the disciplines or the undivided worship of Lord Krishna. Prabhupada was their first real contact with a spiritual person, and yet even without trying to understand, they became absorbed in his kirtan and in what he had to say. Carl would invite them. Hey, come on, this is genuine, this is real. You'll like it. It's music, it's dance, it's celebration. Carl saw that people just felt good being in the Swami's presence and meditating on the chanting and eating the Swami's cooking. It was unlike anything they had experienced before, except maybe for their moments of creative insight. Somebody else like to read?
Okay. Yet for Carl and Ava, Prabhupada's simple presence created difficulty. Never before during his whole stay in America had he been a more inconvenient or unwanted guest. Carl's studio was arranged for him and his wife to live in it alone, using the bedroom, kitchen, and living room any way they liked. If they wanted to smoke marijuana or eat meat or whatever, that was their prerogative. This was Carl's home. He lived there with his wife Ava and their dogs and cats, but now they had to share it with the Swami. Almost at once, the situation became intolerable for Ava. She resented the Swami's presence in her home. She was a feminist, a liberated white woman with a black husband and a good job. She didn't like the Swami's views on women. She hadn't read his books or attended his classes, but she had heard that he was opposed to sexual intercourse, except for conceiving children, and that in his view, a woman was supposed to be shy and chaste and help her husband in spiritual life. She knew about the Swami's 4 rules: no meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, or gambling, and she definitely did not want Carl's Swami trying to change their ways to suit his. And he had better not expect her to wait on him as a servant. She sensed the Swami objecting to almost everything she did. If she were to seek his advice, he would probably ask her to stop taking drugs, get rid of the cats and dogs, stop drinking, and stop contraceptive sex. If the Swami had his way, they would probably eat only at certain times and only certain foods. Ava was a heavy smoker, so he probably wouldn't like being around her. She was ready for a confrontation. But Prabhupada was not one to make intolerable demands while living in another's home. He kept to his allotted corner of the loft, and he made no demands or criticisms. Hadn't he seen his host and butler eating meat and only remarked, "Think nothing of it"? Nevertheless, his imposing spiritual presence made Ava sorry Carl had ever met him. To Ava, the Swami was an inimical force, and she, being candid and independent, let him know. As soon as he asked whether she could bring him something, she replied, "Get it yourself." Carol Baker saw the situation as being extremely uncomfortable and tense. Ava was quite resentful. Ava complained to Carol. Here she was paying rent for the loft, working hard, and this man was trying to change their way of life. Carol, Ava couldn't handle his teachings, and she couldn't handle his influence over Carl. She didn't feel so constrained, but she felt that Swamiji was making Carl feel constrained. This was Ava's main objection. The Swami was influencing Carl. Her relationship with Carl had only recently begun, and Carl was aware that she needed much of his time. He agreed with his wife, yet he couldn't refuse the Swami. He was interested in Indian music, poetry, and religion, and here was the living authority, vastly knowledgeable in all facets of Indian culture, right in his home. Prabhupada would cook his meals in their kitchen, and right away Carl would be there, eager to learn the art of Indian cuisine. Carl also wanted the Swami to show him how to play the drum. They would have long talks together. Carl was trying to be something he really wasn't, but he never suggested that the Swami had to leave. Swami, I am sure, was astute enough to pick up on this tension. As soon as he could, he tried to move to another place. Gradually, Carl reached an impasse in his relationship with Prabhupada. He couldn't share his life with both his wife and the Swami, and ultimately he was more inclined towards his wife. Carl, I couldn't see my loft becoming a temple. I was raising cats and dogs, and he wanted them removed. He used to call me a meat eater, but then he changed our diet. Of course, he was hitting the American culture, which doesn't know what all this business is. I had to put it on myself as much as anyone. I could understand and absorb India through an impersonal agency like a book or a record, but here was a living representative of Godhead, and to me it was as difficult as anything I've ever had to do before or since. Prabhupada was not insensitive to the distress his presence was causing. He didn't want to inconvenience anyone, and of course he could have avoided all inconvenience, both for himself and for people like Ava, if he had never come to America. But he wasn't concerned with convenience or inconvenience, pleasing Ava or displeasing her. He wanted to teach Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had a mission, and Cole's Loft didn't seem to be the right base for it. Prabhupada's friends all agreed he should move more into the centre of things. The Bowery and Chinatown were too far out of the way. They would find him a new place. Forced by conditions he accepted as Krishna's mercy, Prabhupada sat patiently, trying not to disturb anyone, yet speaking about Krishna consciousness day and night. Cole assured him that with half a dozen people searching it, it wouldn't take long to find a new place, and they would all chip in together and help him with the rent. Well, let someone else have a go.
A week passed, and no one had found a suitable place for the Swami. One day, Prabhupada suggested that he and Carl take a walk up to Michael Grant's place and ask him to help. Mike, I was awakened one morning very early, and Carl was on the phone saying, Swamiji and I were just taking a walk and we thought we'd come up and see you. I said, but it's too early in the morning. He said, well, Swamiji wants to see you. They were very nearby, just down the street, so I had to quickly get dressed, and by the time I got to the door, they were there. I was totally unprepared, but invited them up. The television had been on from the previous night, and there were some cartoons on. The Swami sat between Carl and me on the couch. I was keeping a pet cat, and the cat jumped up on Swamiji's lap, and he abruptly knocked it off onto the floor. We began to talk, but Swamiji glanced over at the cartoons on the television set and said, this is nonsense. Suddenly, I realized that the television was on and it was nonsense, and I got up very quickly saying, why, yes, it is nonsense, and turned it off. As Prabhupada talked, he tried to impress on Mike how difficult it was for him to live with Carl and Ava. And Mike listened, but was the Swamiji so sure he couldn't go back to the Bowery loft and live with David Allen? Except for that one incident, it had been a nice setup, hadn't it? Prabhupada explained that David had become a madman from too much LSD. He was dangerous. Mike gave the Swami a half incredulous look. David Allen, dangerous? Prabhupada then told a story. There's an old saying in India that you get yourself a spiritual master, you sit opposite him, you learn everything from him that you can, then you kill him, you move his body to one side, and then you sit in his place, and you become the guru. As Prabhupada spoke, Mike began to feel that David was dangerous, so he didn't ask for any more details. Mike could see that Swamiji was appealing to him for help, and that as they all sat together on the couch, Mike and Carl quietly nodded in agreement. The Swami was looking at Mike, and Mike was trying to think. So how can we help Swamiji? Carl interjected. Mike explained that he was a pianist, he had to practice every day, he had 2 pianos, 2 sets of drums, a vibraphone and other instruments right there in his apartment. Musicians were always coming over to practice and they all played their instruments for hours. Also, he was living with a girl and there was a cat in the apartment. But Mike promised that he would help find the Swami a new place. Prabhupada thanked him and along with Carl stood to leave. Mike felt obligated. He was good at getting things done. He wanted to do this for the Swami. So next day he went to the Village Voice, got the first newspaper off the press, looked through the classified ads until he found a suitable prospect and phoned the landlord. It was a storefront on 2nd Avenue and an agent and Mr. Gardiner agreed to meet Mike there. Carl and the Swami also agreed to come. Mr. Gardiner and Mike were the first to arrive. Mike noted the unusual hand-painted sign, matchless gifts, above the front window. It was a holdover, Mr. Gardner explained, from when the place had been a nostalgic gift shop. Mike proceeded to describe the Swami as a spiritual leader from India, an important author, and a Sanskrit scholar. The rental agent seemed receptive. As soon as Prabhupada and Carl arrived and everyone had been congenially introduced, Mr. Gardiner showed them the small storefront. Prabhupada, Carl and Mike carefully considered its possibilities. It was empty, plain and dark. The electricity had not been turned on and it needed repainting. It would be good for meetings, but not for the Swami's residence. but $125 a month, it seemed promising. Then Mr. Gardner revealed a small second-floor apartment just across the rear courtyard, directly behind the storefront. Another $71 a month, and the Swami could live there, although Mr. Gardner would have to repaint it. The total rent would come to $196, and Carl, Mike, and the others would pitch in. Prabhupada had the idea of making Mr. Gardner the first official trustee of the his fledgling Krishna Consciousness Society. During the conversation, he presented Mr. Gardner with a 3-volume set of his Srimad Bhagavatam, and inside the front cover, he wrote a personal dedication and then signed it, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Mr. Gardner felt flattered and honored to receive these books from their author himself. He agreed to become a trustee of the new Society for Krishna Consciousness and so pay the society $20 a month. It's 7:30 now. Mantra?
We're basically on the last page, Addy, so
Okay.
you can walk it home if you want.
Okay. Mr. Gardner took a week to paint the apartment. Meanwhile, Mike arranged for electricity installed, and he and Carl raised the first month's rent among their friends. When everything was ready, Mike gave Prabhupada a call at Carl's. Now it was time to move the Swami into his new place. A few friends who were on hand accompanied the Swami over to the Bowery loft. Maybe they weren't prepared to become his surrendered disciples, but contributing toward the first month's rent and volunteering a few hours of work to help set up his place were exactly the kind of things they could do very willingly. At the loft, they all gathered up portions of the Swami's belongings, and then they started out on foot up Bowery. It was like a safari, a caravan of 6 men loaded with Prabhupada's things. Michael carried the heavy Roberts reel-to-reel, and even the Swami carried 2 suitcases. They did everything so quickly that it wasn't until they were well on their way and Mike's arm began to ache that he realized, why didn't we bring a car? It was the end of June, and a hazy summer sun poured its heat down into the Bowery jungle. Starting and stopping, the strange safari, stretching for over a block, slowly trekked along. Prabhupada struggled with his suitcases past the seemingly unending row of restaurant supply shops and lamp stores between Grand, Broome, and Spring Streets. Sometimes he paused and rested, setting his cases down. He was finally moving from the Bowery. His electrician friend on 72nd Street would have been relieved, although perhaps he would have disapproved of the 2nd Avenue address also. At least he was finished residing on Skid Row. He walked on past the homeless men outside the Salvation Army shelter, past the open-door taverns, stopping at streetlights, standing alongside total strangers, keeping an eye on the progress of his procession of friends who struggled along behind him. Someone else, I'm a bit tired.
The Bowery artists and musicians saw him as highly evolved. They felt the spirit was moving him and were eager to help him set up his own place so he could do his valuable spiritual thing and spread it to others. He was depending on them for help, yet they knew he was on a higher level. He was his own protector, or as he said, God protected him. The Swami and his young friends reached the corner of Bowery and Hudson, turned right and proceeded east, gazing steadily ahead as he walked. Prabhupada saw the southern end of 2nd Avenue 1 block away. The 2nd Avenue, he would turn left, walk just 1 block north across 1st Street and arrive at his new home. As he passed the IND subway entrance, the storefront came into view, matchless gift. He gripped his suitcase and moved ahead. At 2nd Avenue in Houston, he hurried through a break in the rapid traffic. He could see green trees holding their heads above the high courtyard wall, reaching up to the overgrown weeds in the space between the front and rear buildings of his new address. The street side buildings housed his meeting hall, and the rear building, the apartment where he would live and translate. Adjoining the storefront building on its north side was a massive 9-story warehouse. The storefront structure was only 6 stories and seemed appended to the larger building like its diminutive child. On its southern side, Prabhupada's new temple showed a surface of plain cement and was free of any adjoining structure. There was only the spacious lot of the busy mobile service station that bordered on First Street. As Prabhupada approached the storefront, he could see two small lanterns decorating the narrow doorway.
There was no certainty of what awaited him here, but already there had been good signs that these American young people, mad though they sometimes were, could actually take part in Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. Perhaps this new address would be the place where he could actually get a footing with his International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
Jai. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Hare Krishna. So yeah, thanks everyone. We read a little bit longer, just than usual, I think, just to finish that chapter. But anyway, we've got time if anyone wants to share anything. Yeah. Something struck. We just started reading the seventh chapter of Bhagavad Gita, and there was a bit that jumped out where Prabhupada says, when you're doing, or Satsvarupa Maharaj says, when you're doing what Prabhupada's doing, you become vulnerable and insecure. And I was just thinking of that. It's really true. And there's at the start of the 7th chapter, Krishna says, you just work with your mind attached to me and full conscious of me, and you'll know me in full without any doubt. And that bit really jumped out at me. You know, you just carry on working. Materially speaking, you're always going to be vulnerable and insecure, basically, materially speaking. But actually, there's some nice parts of the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna, he really reassures Arjuna that actually, no, you can do this without a doubt if you just keep following. So I thought that was something that jumped out. I thought was nice.
Radhapriya put a nice comment. She said, we read how Srila Prabhupada taught that everything is illusion, including our loved ones in this world, husband, wife, children, how at the time of death we will forget even them. I know of a spiritual teacher, not a Vaishnav, but with a good knowledge of deep truths, the temporary nature of everything in this world and the eternal nature of the true self. He desired to be of service and loved Krishna Kirtan. He taught with his wife, and they were especially close to each other. In his later years, he developed a serious health condition which deteriorated his brain function, and he began to have memory loss. At the end of his life, he lost all memory and didn't even recognize his wife, but he never forgot his eternal nature and the bliss he knew and touched in kirtan, meditation, and prayer. This was described by his wife after he left his body. He wasn't remembering Krishna directly, but the fact that he forgot everything except his eternal nature seemed to me a great example of the first lesson Srila Prabhupada taught. That reminds me of a video I saw a few years ago that was circulating on Facebook, and it was in America, and I forget her name, but she was an older lady.
I was just thinking.
And I think she had dementia, and she'd completely forgotten everything. But when the devotees went to visit her in the care home, and she was still chanting Hare Krishna, and she could remember all of the tunes, but she'd, I think, even forgotten her own name, even who she was. But she didn't forget the chanting. It was a really amazing video, but I've never been able to find it.
When the devotees were there, the people in the care home, the devotees explained to the nurses in the care home what the chanting was. And they were like, oh, wow, okay, she does that all the time. She's always doing that. We didn't know what it was. We thought, you know. And
she'd forgotten everything else. Yeah. So that gave me a lot of hope.
Really amazing. It's like really good proof, isn't it? That everything else is temporary. But yeah. Thanks, Radhapriya. And she wrote in the chat that her message was too long, but I don't think it was.
Too long.
Sorry to contradict you, Radhapriya, but I don't think it was too long. Not at all. It was brilliant. Thanks. great when Prabhupada knocked that cat off the.
Off
I don't know why.
lap.
I'm not sure why, but I really like that for some
It made
reason.
me giggle too.
Yeah. I don't know. In someone else's house, not having it. Yeah. Hare Krishna. Back to Vinopapu. You've unmuted. Sorry.
Yeah, it was just thinking about that story about people forgetting everything. I heard this story from the Bhagavatam. I'm told it's the 6th canto, but I'm not absolutely sure. But one devotee was meditating, and he was so absorbed in his spiritual life that he just completely forgotten his material existence, like his body and his mind. And then, like, after a couple of days or something like that, he was like, oh, where's that body gone? He'd it kind of like just lost all connection with material life sort of thing, and just got completely absorbed in the spiritual, So I suppose, that it can happen, to sort of different extents, with different people, without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, in its practice in Krishna consciousness, we're definitely transcending the material life to a certain extent, right? I mean, I don't want to remember a bit of the material life, There's plenty of things I don't want to remember. It's like, oh yeah, I think I'll chant Hare Krishna now, When certain things start coming to mind, it's like, oh well, better chant now, So yeah, I think we at times as well, we forget what material life existence is really like. I think we forget at times, and kind of get a bit out of touch with people that are, trying to put a brave face on and all that, but, a lot of people are very insecure. Certainly right now in the pandemic, there must be a lot of people feeling very insecure and wondering what's going to happen in the future and what's going on in the world and things like that. So, I mean, I think it's a good time for us to take an opportunity to give others, and to do things for others, because personally myself, I'm making an effort, like, just to, try and like create a nice atmosphere in my home and things like that, and my actions, so that some, good spiritual energy goes out to the world, I feel like, well, it's, it'll help somebody somewhere, I just feel like that right now,
Yeah, we noticed that Hema was saying the other day at the beginning of the pandemic, which is like almost a year ago now. It's weird. It feels weird that it's been that long. But so many people were coming into online programs. We were doing, there's quite a few people still come now. But like so many people were coming. You were saying so many people were like really insecure. There was real panic, right? Because it was a whole new thing. And so people were like rushing to, try and
find some shelter.
Yeah, find some shelter, exactly. And but then as it kind of wore on, everyone kind of got used to like lockdown and queuing at Superman, all this kind of stuff that was going on. It's actually interesting how easily you can forget as well. That like, that lady that was in the home or something, she must have been like really, like the kirtan must have made a really deep impression on her heart. And so I think there was I remember Dean and Brighton told me a story. It was obviously like a well-known story, but one devotee who was in like a car crash or he had a heart attack or something and he was going to leave his body. And somehow or another, as he was about to leave his body, the theme tune for an advert he used to see as a kid came into his head and he couldn't get it out. And he couldn't chant Hare Krishna. He was just hearing this theme tune of that advert, a jingle. And so, but he survived. And after that, he said, oh, I have to take my chanting really seriously now. He said, obviously, I haven't been taking it seriously enough because there was all this other stuff still there that I was attached to or something. So just thinking like that, it's good if we can, yeah, it's obviously really powerful, isn't it? That progress you make is totally beyond everything material. But I always think of that story because I think, oh, I really hope it doesn't happen to me. You have to be really sincere when you chant. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember at times in my life, because I first started going to the temple when I was 20, you know, but, you know, I didn't always keep the practices up in my 20s. But I remember, like, in difficult situations, I would start chanting, you know. I would take shelter of Krishna, I would start chanting, you know. Like, I would, you know, when I was in court or something like that, you know, end up in court, you know, after the weekend out sort of thing, you know, and yeah, I'd be chanting, you know, I'd be chanting, you know, and I remember once I even ended up in Brixton prison, you know, and like, I mean, it was heavy, it was heavy. I was in with these like, you know, top security people and all that, and I just got myself put in solitary confinement and started chanting, you know, started like doing japa and things. I got out, you know, but I mean, I remember it was like in intense situations. I always kind of, you know, used to chant even, even if I was, you know, going out with a girl that, you know, I was pretty nervous about meeting and all that, you know, I would chant a wee bit, you know, to calm me down and things, you know. Yeah, so, I mean, what else is going on out there that we don't really know about? You know, who's chanting, who's reading, who's got, you know, respect for the Krishna movement. I think there's a lot of that going on out there, you know. I think there's a lot, and I think we can tap into it, you know. There's a lot of people from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds. They got a lot of respect for Krishna and devotees, but they won't come out with it in public. I've noticed people won't come out with it in public, not right now, they won't. But there is a lot of respect and books and flats and people with, you know, deep appreciation and things like that, you know. There definitely is, without a doubt. I know it for sure. I know it for sure myself. I do know it for sure. So I think it's good if we tap into that and get as many people involved as possible, you know.
Jai. Jai. Hare Krishna. Thanks, Prabhu. I don't know if anybody else has any last comments or anything. Everyone's happy. Brilliant. We have to do some kind of podcast or something one day with Bhaktivinoda and his stories.
Yeah.
Of adventures in Krishna consciousness. I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah. As long as I don't, I need to think carefully before I do that. I don't want to frighten people and tell the wrong stories.
Oh, okay. I thought you might end up giving evidence about something that.
I had a lot of good fun. Even when I wasn't following strictly, I had a lot of good fun and made a lot of good friends. And yeah, amazing stories how people took up Krishna consciousness, you know, and you know, and the first half of the 80s, I done more preaching in the pub than in the temple, you know, but still, some of the people I was preaching with went and joined the temple, you know. Yeah, so yeah, lots of different, you know, but yeah, pretty amazing actually, you know, pretty amazing. Nice how Krishna works, you know, even if we're not following everything, and how Krishna still works through us and still encourages and helps us, and you know, people still kind of take us seriously, even though you know, we may not be the strictest devotees in the world, you know, because, I mean, for a full-time devotee, a lot of materialists think that's amazing. It's totally amazing what they're doing. As far as I can see, devotees are generally doing a bit better than they think, you know. And yeah. So yeah, I don't want to go on too much anyway.
No, thanks for your. That's it's a really nice note to leave it on, actually, without obviously being complacent. Yeah, I think a lot of devotees are doing better than they think they are. I hope I am. Jai. All right. Well, yeah, back to Vinod Prabhu. Thank you. Thanks to Palika as well for reading. Adi, Mahamantra Prabhu, thanks for reading. And Radha Priya and Lucy, thanks for letting us read to you and for sharing everything that you shared. And Lucy, I hope you feel better. Yeah. We're only down the road, so if you need anything, just let us know and we'll just drive over and do it. Whatever it is, we can take care of it. Jai Srila Prabhupada ki, Jai Sri Vaishnava Sadhu Sangha ki, Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande, Hari Bol. Thanks everybody. Hare Krishna. See you next time. Hari Bol.